True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
So, as fraternal twins, Betty and Peggy were together from the very beginning of their lives. And as adults, they were very different people, but they still remained best friends. Then in 1992, they either conspired together to have Betty's husband killed, or they fought together to prove their innocence in his murder. Join us at the quiet end for Split Decision. After Betty's husband, Dr. Jack Wilson, was brutally murdered in his own home, suspicions turned to his wife, Betty. Betty was an outspoken, hard-headed woman who had engaged in numerous extramarital affairs, so her promiscuity, alcoholism, and an adulterous affair with a black man in racist Alabama may have turned the police and eventually a jury against her. So if the prosecution's theory was that Betty and Peggy conspired together to kill Jack, then why was Betty found guilty and then Peggy was acquitted? It may have just been the result of prejudice against Betty, the wild one, and more appreciation for the sweet and amiable Peggy. I can't think of any other reason for it, but we're going to talk about it.
Yes, we are. And we're going to drink a nice beer called El Gordo from Good People Brewing Company in Birmingham. This is a Russian Imperial Stout. It's again a heavy hitter, 13.9% ABV. Beer is a dark brown color, small mocha head, nice aroma, dark chocolate, espresso, and molasses. Expressed well in the taste. Espresso, dark chocolate, and the molasses isn't quite as noticeable as in the aroma. This is a big-bodied beer. The alcohol will warm you up as you drink it.
Yeah, it'll also make us take naps. It's a lot of alcohol in that beer. It's a strong beer.
Well, we'll split it with a few people.
Okay. All right. Well, let's open one. All right, down to the quiet end. It does smell very chocolatey and delicious.
Yeah, it's a good bedtime beer.
I think so. Yeah, it is. But we're not going to bed yet, so let's take it easy. What do you think?
Oh, we will.
Okay. All right. Well, this case is really kind of amazing. I just don't understand how it turned out the way it did. So maybe our listeners will be able to call and write in after this and try and explain it to us. But we'll go over everything that I was able to find out about it.
It's a strange case, I gotta tell you.
It really is, yeah. So start us out with their childhoods.
So Betty Woods was born the twin of her sister Peggy on July 14th, 1945 in East Gadsden, Alabama. Betty would later describe her family as typical lower middle class. During World War II, Gadsden had been a munitions and chemical manufacturing center. Between 1930 and the end of the war, the city's population doubled. So there was a sudden transition to peacetime manufacturing, but by the end of the war and return of the soldiers was more than the local economy could handle. In the late 40s and early 50s, there were layoffs in the steel mills and the rubber plants, so many families suffered the hardest times they had known since the Great Depression.
Absolutely, but Betty's family was not really poor. Parents Oscar and Nell Woods were nowhere near wealthy, but they got by okay. When other families were losing their homes, Oscar moved his family out of their apartment and actually bought them a small brick house. Oscar was a Gadsden policeman, and this was very dangerous work through the 1960s, and the police weren't paid anywhere near enough to support their families and live decent lives. So they made up for this with corruption. A lot of corruption. So like a lot of the South, the area around Gadsden had remained dry after the repeal of Prohibition. Most of the police were paid off by the bootleggers, and most of the bootleggers were firemen. Racism was going strong in Gadsden, and Oscar was as bad as any of them at harassing and abusing the black men around town. Oscar took money from the bootleggers and used it to support his many mistresses across town. He worked for the Union Busters, too, and it was believed that he knew what had happened to many people, black and white, who had disappeared from Gadsden. But the scariest part of this is that Oscar was really just the norm in this police force at the time, if you can believe it.
Well, I can.
But Oscar was also a heavy drinker. He drank with his various women at the illegal establishments that he helped to protect. He even drank in his police car, and he drank in his pickup truck. By the time he would come home at night, he was heavily under the influence. And on some nights he came home in a rage and woke his children with a flashlight in their faces. So from the time the girls were very young, Peggy was the peacemaker. She took Betty with her into the bathroom and closed the door, and the two little girls whispered to each other for hours, while Peggy tried to talk Betty into doing whatever was necessary, just to keep their father calm. Betty and Peggy had two older sisters, Goodell and Martha, and they were 8 and 10 years older than the twins. So they were pretty independent by the time the twins were in grade school. But their mother, Nell, was very loving. Most of what Nell earned at her job she spent on the little girls. Every Friday night she walked them a mile to the movie theater. And Nell Woods was never one to complain. She never said anything to imply that her life was anything but normal and happy. So the terrifying times when their father came home drunk and raging were not the only reality for the twins. They also had warmth and comfort that they received from their mother. Both were very pretty little girls, but it was Peggy who had inherited the very best of each of her parents' very good looks. So she was considered the real beauty of the family.
Yeah, Peggy had perfect Southern manners, and she spoke with the gracious Alabama accent of the middle and upper middle classes. She was always perfectly in control of herself. Social lines in Gadsden had everything to do with money, and the Woods family had none. But Peggy's good looks and graciousness made her popular in high school. She was chosen for every honor offered by Gadsden High that in any way linked with physical beauty. She was sophomore class maid, junior class maid, homecoming queen, among others. Peggy eventually developed the persona of a Southern girl who has often spoken to audiences in school and at church. She was invited to join a high school sorority whose other members were mainly girls from wealthy families. As she did whenever she gained acceptance into any new group, the first thing Peggy did was to ask if her sister Betty could join the group as well.
Yeah, shy and awkward and bookish, Betty might have preferred to be left alone, but Peggy just would not hear of it. In their little brick house, Peggy was the family hero, and her twin Betty would share some part in Peggy's life. It was Betty, though, who was more interested in boys, and she ended up doing things Peggy would never have dreamed of doing, like skipping school, coming home late in cars with boys who'd been drinking, and defying parents and every other authority figure she came across. But for a while after high school, the twins' lives continued to be linked and pretty much alike. They both married without going to college. Both had babies right away, but each stayed married for only a few years. Betty left her husband, a good man and a good father to her 3 little boys, because he wanted to tell her what to do, what makeup to wear, and how to act. She left for Huntsville, and her husband agreed to keep the little boys until she got settled, but that would never happen. Now Peggy left her husband because she disapproved of the way that he behaved, and she left him for a man named Wayne Lowe, the handsome young choir director at Calvary Baptist Church. Wayne was married too, and he got divorced in order to marry Peggy. He took immediately to Peggy's little girl and boy and became the one that they would call Dad. Now Wayne and Peggy moved to a wooded subdivision on Logan Martin Lake, about 30 miles away from Gadsden. Wayne taught school, and he became the choir director in the church, and he sold household items door to door in the evenings and on the weekends. Peggy went back to school and completed her teaching degree. Then she taught at the elementary school with Wayne, and she also often worked second jobs. They always dressed well and drove nice cars, but they lived within their means. And as Peggy had been the hero of their little brick house back on Hoke Street, as an adult she was compelled to fix things for other families who were having a hard time. So on several occasions she took in unwed teenage mothers for however long it took them to resolve their issues. One young woman stayed with her for over a year, and she once took in a homeless family who were living in a dump and sleeping in their car. There were several very young neglected children who she brought home. She bathed and fed them, and then she and Wayne found them housing and work. The rest of the family never complained about this either, even when Peggy loaned money from the family's scarce savings to anyone in need who she came across.
She's a nice woman.
Very nice. After Betty left Gadsden for Huntsville, her life became very different from Peggy's. As close as they had been, it was a relief for Betty to be away from her twin. And in some ways, all of Peggy's fixing and helping had kept Betty from having the fun she wanted to have. She worked 2 and 3 jobs, but she spent most of what she earned on clothing and nice cars. She never did bring her 3 boys up from Gadsden. But their father was a good man, and Betty was allowed to visit them often. In Huntsville in the 1970s, alone and on her own, Betty was really enjoying the attention of many men.
So Betty became a heavy drinker and started using drugs, including cocaine. She led what she felt was an exciting life. She worked at a JCPenney store, never did have much extra cash after paying her bills. So she took a job at the Cosmopolitan Health Club, working evenings. She really enjoyed that job, and it would end up changing her life. A few years after she had come to Huntsville, the city had a major new commercial hospital being built, and the addition of the new hospital was important in elevating Huntsville with a major regional medical center. Young doctors were coming in from all over the country. A woman whose husband was a major investor in the new hospital belonged to the health club where Betty worked. One evening, she suggested to Betty that she apply for a job at the new hospital. So Betty was hired, and she worked at the hospital as a unit secretary. And within a few years, Betty had completed a curriculum for nurses at the University of Alabama. Now she too could be a hero. A happy but unstable time for Betty. She became an expert in kidney dialysis, which was in demand at this hospital. She worked long hours, enjoying her work with a passion. She still played hard away from work, and her life was driven by both self-indulgence and selflessness. Then one day, in 1976, a nervous ophthalmologist gave a commonly used drug to an elderly patient in the middle of surgery, and the drug caused the patient to go into renal failure. Surgery had to be stopped, and the patient was rushed to another room where Nurse Betty Woods began an emergency kidney dialysis.
Yeah, so Betty just took over this patient. She was focused on her work and her patient, and she didn't notice at first when this ophthalmologist came into the room with her. He was a little guy, 33 years old, with shiny black hair and big brown eyes. He paced around the room, holding his head, sighing, and worrying aloud. "Leave me alone, doctor," Betty said to him. Dr. Jack Wilson said this was one of his favorite patients, and he just couldn't bear to lose her. And then as he left the room, Betty glanced his way, and she thought to herself, well, there goes the cutest little thing I've ever seen in my life. I love that story. I would imagine it has something to do with the woman's history. It was an elderly woman.
Yeah.
I'm sure she had some condition. I just think it's adorable that she took charge, and he's the doctor, and he's this nervous little guy, and she thought, gosh, he's really cute. She liked him.
Yeah.
I guess he kind of had his eye on her for a while, but he wasn't the kind of guy who was going to say anything.
He wasn't going to make any moves on her?
No, and he was married, of course, too. So Jack Wilson's path to becoming an ophthalmologist with a practice in Huntsville, Alabama, was actually long, difficult, and highly unusual. He never knew who his biological father was, and no one even tried to give him a name or a description of this guy. His siblings would say Carolyn English, his real mother, was a young, attractive single woman at the end of World War II who ended up with a married man for a lover instead of a husband of her own. So she worked hard as a waitress and had children out of wedlock, whom she wasn't able to support. So hers was definitely not a respectable life, but she wasn't a sex worker either. The woman who raised him, Werda Wilson, had always told Jack that his mother was a whore, and that was after Jack was 10 years old and had figured out that Werda wasn't his real mother and that Carolyn was. Werda Wilson was a real oddball. She used to stuff pillows in her dress and walk around telling people she was pregnant. Then she'd leave for a few days, saying she was going to a hospital in Chicago to give birth, and she'd come home with another baby, adopted from some girl who couldn't take care of it. And Jack was the youngest of Carolyn English's biological children. Werda had adopted his 2 older sisters from Carolyn, and she had adopted younger twins from another woman. But Werda was indifferent with all the children once she had possession of them, so it's kind of difficult to understand why she'd been so eager to have them in the first place. Carolyn did visit whenever she could. She was a pretty, affectionate woman, unlike Werda. Her relationship to the children was never explained to them, because that was part of the deal that Carolyn had made with Werda. But the great love of Jack's childhood would turn out to be Bill Wilson, Werda's husband. Bill was a warm-hearted, intelligent man who adored the bright, funny, tiny little boy that he called Jackie Boy. Bill Wilson had worked as a newspaper man and an editor, but life had not been easy for him in his later years. So most of the time when Jack was growing up, Bill worked as a cook, and he came home tired, but he never turned his back on the little boy. Jack really brought a spark of life back to Bill Wilson at the end of a long, hard day, but it worked both ways, too. Jack would make up stories to entertain Bill. He went to school, which he loved, but he was so small for his age and seemed so odd to the other children that he was unable to play in the neighborhood. He was really a target of bullies. So he came straight home from school each day, and Jack spent his afternoons watching television, reading books, and daydreaming. In the early evening, when he was tired and lonely, Jack would crawl under Werta's big bed and read books. He spent long hours looking through the cheap set of encyclopedias that Bill had bought one volume at a time from the grocery store. And one thing Jack loved is he loved to learn. Eventually, Jack's teachers told Werta that Jack was actually more than just bright, he might be a prodigy. Werta then had a new interest in him, so she took him down to a radio station in Chicago to audition for a quiz show. The producers chose him and put him on the show. He was funny, quick, and answered all the questions correctly. And he won a puppy.
Wow, good for him.
Yeah, and Bill built a house and a dog run for the puppy, and the puppy, of course, became Jack's best friend. He wasn't lonely anymore. He ran home to his puppy after school and kept it at his side every moment. But 2 years later, when his puppy was hit by a car and killed, Jack was devastated. He cried for days, and Bill was the only one who could comfort him.
Bill died of cancer when Jack was 15. For weeks, Jack was paralyzed by grief. He went to school because it offered some relief, but the rest of the time, he lay in his tiny bedroom and sobbed quietly to himself. Then one evening, Jack came out of the bedroom and said to Werta, "I'm going to get a job to help you with money." He came home 2 days later with news of an afternoon job he got doing bookkeeping and filing for a trucking company. Now his employers liked him immediately and increased his duties, giving him raises and some small bonuses. A few weeks later, Jack brought Werta some money, and while she sat and counted it, he told her that he had gotten a Social Security number and was changing his last name from English to Wilson. Bill was the only father he had ever had, and he wanted to take his name.
So just kind of a remarkable kid.
He does.
I really get a kick out of the story about Jack. He was admitted 2 years early to Occidental College, where he began his lifelong habit of constant study. He worked at his bookkeeping job, he continued helping to support Werta and the 2 younger children, and he studied. His wardrobe was always mismatched and rumpled, and he was pretty much just invisible to women. After he finished his classes, completed his duties at work, and then checked in at home to see if Werta and the twins needed anything, Jack would go straight to the library, where he studied until the early hours of the morning. So his dietary habits were horrible. He ate candy bars and potato chips and washed them down with Cokes. And it was during this time, and later when he was at the University of Tennessee Medical School in Memphis, that Jack learned he was suffering from Crohn's disease. So could his diet have anything to do with that? Is that more of a genetic thing?
It's genetic. Diet does have a tiny role in development, but now it's genetic. It's one of those inflammatory bowel diseases, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis.
Right.
It's not a nice disease, though.
No, it sounds horrible. He really had a horrible time with this.
Yeah, the disease is named for Burrell B. Crohn, who was an American gastroenterologist that described the disease. Primarily a disease of the lower small intestine, the ileum. The symptoms of it are fever, diarrhea, bad cramps, abdominal pain, weight loss, bloody stools. I think you can even get some arthritic changes. So Jack had suffered pretty much all the symptoms on and off since childhood. But once he was in med school, Crohn's got worse. Some of that is the natural history of the disease, but it can get worse. It's supposed to get worse when you're stressed, but for Jack, it seemed to get better. Once he started his residency after medical school, typically a time of stress. Of course, in Jack's case, his internship or residency out of med school is like heaven. He was thrilled every time someone addressed him as doctor. And he had met a woman. She was Julia Kelly, Jr. at Memphis State University. She was a very good-looking woman and was absolutely crazy about Jack. So he must have improved his bearing since his younger days. He's no longer invisible to women.
Well, because he's a doctor.
Oh,
that helps.
That doesn't hurt, I guess.
It definitely helps, trust me.
By the time Jack arrived at Charity Hospital to begin his residency, Julia was his wife, and they were expecting their first child. She was a teacher. They were poor, and Jack was happier than he'd ever been. He continued to feel that way for the next 10 years, through his residency in ophthalmology in Birmingham and into his first years in Huntsville, where he went in 1968 to establish his practice.
Yeah, but the Crohn's came back with a vengeance in the final years of his ophthalmology internship. So the Crohn's came back with a vengeance in the final years of his ophthalmology residency, and he knew he had to do something about it. So he agreed to an operation where the ulcerated portion of his ileum was removed and the remaining part was sutured to his large intestine. Then in 1976, Julia left him. By then they had 2 sons and they had adopted a third. Jack was completely shattered as he had been after Bill Wilson's death. Between medicine and his recurring bouts with Crohn's, he knew he had failed to provide Julia with companionship or a sex life at all. He felt like he'd failed as a husband and a parent, and he really wanted to figure it all out. So Jack and Julia remained friends. Walking off from the dialysis room where Betty was reviving his patient that day, he felt something very pleasant. He liked that nurse. She seemed both bright and tough, and she was very good looking. So for the first time since he and Julia had split up, Jack thought seriously about asking someone out on a date. So he did, and their first date was a basketball game. On their second date, Jack said that she may as well move in with him. Betty was already in love with Jack and happily agreed. But the topic of marriage didn't come up right away. Jack's practice grew under his relentless hard work. He was popular with his patients and with the other doctors. Betty still had a tendency to pull back from social contact, and she felt very overwhelmed when she was at events and felt like she didn't fit in. It was a trait that tended to cut short her relationships with men. But when Jack talked with Betty, he was able to say things to her that made her feel understood and appreciated. There were things Betty could see in Jack, too. His failures as a parent, still very painful to him, had to be weighed against what he had accomplished, because he was now an important man in Huntsville, and he really was adored by his patients. His own experience with poverty had made it impossible for him to withhold treatment from anyone who couldn't pay. And in the years when Medicare and Medicaid were still new, there were many people with bad eyes who couldn't afford to see an ophthalmologist. But Jack loved to practice medicine, and he loved his patients. He had said to people before, if he had to pay to practice, he would. It wasn't about the money to him, he just loved it. So his patients were his biggest fans, and in many ways, especially after Julia left him, they were his family. Jack never raised his fees and was happy to give treatment to anyone who needed it. But then once government insurance was a thing, the money really began to come in. There was a sort of adjusting that went on in many practices. If someone couldn't pay for procedure A, for example, and the government wouldn't pay for it, then the doctor might put down procedure B, for which the government would pay. So Jack started grossing as much as $1 million a year from his practice. Insurance-savvy staff members took over the computers and rearranged the billing process. So now every possible penny was gained from the government insurance programs. And one of the people who really understood the business of government-paid medical services was Betty. Kidney dialysis, her field, was very expensive. And when dialysis was added to the procedures that Medicare would pay for, Betty was good at seeing to it that this worked in the hospital's favor. She was so good at this, in fact, that a new private entity asked her to leave the hospital and come to work in Atlanta as an administrator, where she would help setting up dialysis clinics all around the South. So this was a big job.
Very big job.
Yeah. But by this time, Betty couldn't imagine her life without Jack. Still, he urged her to take the job. Did it mean his feelings for her were less serious than hers for him? He said no. They would continue their relationship long distance by commuting. He told Betty that he would go to Atlanta and pay for her to come back to Huntsville for visits. He thought that she needed to achieve success in her own right. And what Jack said made sense. Betty knew he was smart and she really respected his opinion. But there were things about Jack's manner that were irritating her. She thought that he had learned as a child to shield himself from disappointment by telling himself he didn't need relationships. Anyway, she took the job. She was very effective at seeing to it that the government would pay for new dialysis centers almost as fast as the company could buy the real estate and the equipment to build them. And Jack was really good about getting on the plane almost every week and coming to see her. So for a while that went quite well.
Yeah, it's tough, though, maintaining a long-distance relationship.
Sure. Yeah, they're both people who have their issues, for sure.
Yeah.
But they seem to bring out the best in each other most of the time. Jack called her every morning, and she continued to date other men occasionally at night with Jack knowing about it. But for the most part, she really wasn't interested in the other men, but her job continued to improve. There was a bar in her office that was fully stocked with liquor, which she never touched during the day. But then she began drinking every night to fall asleep. Then, in early 1978, Jack called and told Betty that the Crohn's disease was just getting worse. He thought the long-distance relationship was too stressful, and he asked her to come back to Huntsville and get married. So this was a terrible blow to both of them, but Jack would have to have surgery that would leave him with an ostomy. So he'd have this bag on his abdomen that would collect stool. Really tough for a person, for your body image especially.
Body image and just the thought of collecting kind of liquidy stool in a bag attached to your abdomen.
Well, I remember early in my nursing career, I took care of this poor woman. She was an elderly woman, but still very active, and she had to end up with an ostomy. And this woman would cry every night. She was so upset by it. She was suicidal. It was just really hard for her to live with that. She turned out being okay with it and accepting it, but it took therapy, and there was a group of people with the same problem that would get together, like a support group. And finally, I think she did okay, but it was a long road for her. It was certainly not easy. So yeah, it's a really big deal. But Betty was supportive, at least in the beginning.
Yeah. So Betty quit the job and moved her things into Jack's apartment in Huntsville. She was nervous about the decision because she did love her job in Atlanta, but she loved Jack. Now, his Crohn's disease was just getting worse and worse. So he ended up having the operation and was left with an ostomy bag. So the surgery, combined with his insecurity and the medications he had been put on, made him impotent. Betty was a nurse, so she had seen a lot, but she could not get past the idea of life without sexual intercourse.
No, and her drinking became much worse after that.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of stress going on in this family.
A lot, yeah. By then, they were living in a big house on Boulder Circle. They were a wealthy and prominent couple in Huntsville. Jack's wit made him a real favorite at parties, and his reputation for generosity and humor was very well known. This was never a life that came easily to Betty, though. When she attended her first medical auxiliary reception, she was already drunk at 10 in the morning because she was terrified of the other women, whom she thought of as rich bitches. On her worst days, her social fear made her defensive, and she could be very unpleasant to be around. She spoke coarsely just to shock people. She was suffering frequent alcoholic blackouts, too. And it wouldn't be until 5 years after Betty joined Alcoholics Anonymous and stopped drinking that Jack was able to tell her about these blackouts. Because back when she had them, she would barge into the bedroom at 3 in the morning, rip the bedding off of Jack, and scream at him. She would swear at him and call him an impotent shitbag. But then the next day, she wouldn't remember anything about it. So Jack really didn't know how to deal with this because he did love her.
Well, she got admitted to a hospital in Birmingham. So she detoxed there. She had pancreatitis due to her excessive drinking. Probably had some liver disease, too. Counselors there told her she needed to disabuse herself of the idea that she was going to hide her problem or her recovery from anybody back in Huntsville.
Well, yeah, because at first she's thinking, well, I can just sneak off and get better. But no, this is something you really have to confront, and you have to be willing to talk about it.
Yes.
So the first thing she did when she came home was to join Alcoholics Anonymous. And the first meetings were pretty tough. Betty would go up to the podium in her mink coat and tell her long dramatic stories about how difficult it had been growing up in the shadow of a more beautiful twin sister. But people in the audience had had their own hard times, and many of them would shake their heads skeptically and say, well, that doesn't sound that tough to me. They thought she had it kind of easy. But gradually it worked for Betty, and her fellow members in AA encouraged her to take responsibility for her own life. Then Betty became a very active member of AA, and she would give talks on the disease and work to help others. So once she'd been sober for some time, sex was continuing to be a big problem. By this point, Jack couldn't even talk about it, and even though her recovery seemed to be going well, she found herself faced with a new type of temptation, and that was men. Many of the men in Alcoholics Anonymous were attractive to her, and Betty was especially attracted to a man named Errol Fitzpatrick, a very confident man who was the director of risk management for the city of Huntsville. That he was an African American was not really important to Betty one way or the other. She had had black lovers before, and she just wasn't racist. And Jack would look the other way. But Betty found that infuriating. She began inviting Errol to the house during the day while Jack was at his office. By then, Jack and Betty had separate bedrooms. Jack's refusal to even try to have sex with Betty anymore was very upsetting for her. She wanted him to care, to be jealous, to get angry, and to fight for her, but that just wasn't Jack.
So the only safe place in Betty's life, aside from AA, was exercise. She was a jazzercise fanatic and was convinced she needed to exercise in order to keep her many cosmetic surgeries from sagging.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough, girl.
Right. So Jack and Betty managed to stay together, and one of the things that may have helped them was their grandchildren. Betty babysat every day, loved it. For her, the time with the grandkids was a second chance because of the time she had lost with her own children. Jack came home to see them, even if he would have to return to the office or hospital afterwards and work until late at night. He tried to give them the same kind of attention he had received from Bill Wilson when he was a little boy.
So just let me ask you something. What if there was someone out there who kept a log of every single thing you did every minute of the day? I think that'd be pretty creepy. But when you're online, that's exactly what's happening. Your internet provider, like AT&T or Verizon, is allowed to store logs of every website you've ever visited, and they can legally sell this data to anyone. That's why we always use ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN reroutes your internet connection through their secure servers, so your internet provider can't see or log what you're doing online. Now, I bet many of you are wondering, well, if I'm routing all my data through a VPN, then wouldn't that just mean that the VPN can see what I'm doing and log my data instead? You're right to think that. Many VPNs do claim to have a no-logs policy, but have been caught logging their customer activity. ExpressVPN is actually the only VPN I trust because they use trusted server technology. In fact, ExpressVPN were the first major VPN provider to engineer all of their VPN servers to run on RAM only. This makes it impossible for their VPN servers to store any data, including logs of any ExpressVPN customer. And you don't have to take my or even ExpressVPN's word for it. ExpressVPN is so confident in their no-logs claim, they even had one of the biggest assurance firms, PricewaterhouseCoopers, audit their technology. So really, it's no wonder that CNET and The Verge have named ExpressVPN the #1 VPN in the world. So stop letting people keep logs of what you do online. Visit expressvpn.com/TCB right now and find out how you can get 3 months free. That's expressvpn.com/TCB. expressvpn.com/TCB. And you can learn more.
So the town of Vincent, Alabama, was a pretty little village along Logan Martin Lake. By 1991, it had become a bedroom community for people who commuted an hour or more to escape city life. The people in Vincent sent their children to the public schools and lived on old farms or in new subdivisions. In August 1991, James White took a small job doing work for Melanie Little, who taught his daughter Kelly Renee at Vincent Elementary. And this is where Betty's sister Peggy Lowe and her husband Wayne were teachers. So if a teacher didn't like something in his or her classroom, they could repair it or build it during the summer months or get someone else to do it at their own expense. So White's daughter's teacher needed to have some shelves built, and in this case, the principal had agreed to supply the lumber if Melanie Little could persuade a parent to do the work. Now, White appeared to be volunteering to do the work for nothing. He did do a nice job, but by the time he had finished explaining his personal problems to Melanie, she felt obligated to do something to help him.
Yeah, so just down the hall, Peggy Lowe was getting her own first-grade classroom ready, while her husband was working on his room. Wayne and Peggy brought their teenage daughter Stephanie to the school to help them. Now at noon, the family had lunch in Peggy's room, and when White had finished building Melanie all the shelves she needed, he continued to hang around the school, suggesting that he needed more help with all of his problems. So Melanie handed him off to Peggy Lowe by suggesting to him that Mrs. Lowe might also need help with her room.
That's a punt, isn't it?
Yeah. So, during lunch, White appeared in the doorway. He was stooped forward and holding his grimy baseball cap in his hands. And he addressed Peggy Lowe as Mrs., a Southern courtesy, and explained that he was looking for more work to do. Peggy's husband Wayne was skeptical, but Peggy agreed to go look at the shelves in Melanie's room. In the time it took for Peggy to walk down the corridor with White, he began sharing his many problems. She gave him work building shelves in her classroom, and every minute he was in the room, he spoke of all the ways that he and his children were suffering. All of James White's stories were laced with his dire financial problems and the hardships on his children. So finally, there were no more shelves to be built in Peggy Lowe's classroom. Peggy went to the principal and persuaded him to hire White to build some risers that the school needed for the chorus. So he agreed to hire him and pay him some money. But for White, this was all business as usual. In the evenings when he was drinking with his buddies, he would talk about Peggy Lowe, how he had her wrapped around his little finger, and how she really wanted him sexually. By the time the work at the school had run out and the school year had begun, White was seriously pestering Peggy. He even sent his little boy Josh, a student at Vincent Elementary, to stop Peggy in the hallway, and the boy handed her a written note. One of White's children had been in the hospital, the note said, and White was distraught over his inability to give the child the care that he needed. He was so depressed that he had attempted suicide. So was it possible that Mrs. Lowe and her husband Wayne might have worked for him at their beautiful house? Wayne was very skeptical and could easily have sent White away packing, but Peggy was the softer one, and White persuaded Peggy to hire him to work on her home. Wayne resisted, but there was finishing work that needed to be done, and with Wayne's busy schedule, he was never going to get it done himself. Mr. White had done a good job at the school, Peggy said, and he seemed to be willing to work on the house at very reasonable rates. So White persuaded Peggy and Wayne to hire him to do several jobs. Then, barely having begun any of the work, he would ask for cash up front.
In the months ahead, White was relentless, and he persuaded Peggy to agree to more work around the house. He even convinced Wayne to get his own mother to pay him thousands of dollars to pour a driveway for her. Each night, when he drank with his friends, White bragged about his hold over Peggy Lowe. He interpreted her kindness as a sign of his own power. So the more money he got out of Peggy, the more powerful he felt.
So along with his complaints, White suggested that things were so difficult he might have to go back to drinking, which he'd never really quit anyway. The problem was that there was no money left that Peggy could use to make White go away. His incessant phone calls had become a big burden. But Peggy just wasn't able to say, "Mr. White, stop calling me." So in the second week of May 1992, when he'd called her to threaten both suicide and a return to drinking, Peggy said, "Mr. White, I just can't help you anymore with money. But my sister Betty, who lives in Huntsville, is a recovering alcoholic, and she might be able to help you. She's married to a doctor, and they're doing a lot of work on their house right now. She's having her kitchen remodeled. Maybe Betty could help you get involved with Alcoholics Anonymous, too, and she and her husband might be able to give you more work, too." So over the next several days, White just nagged Peggy constantly about when he would be able to go to Huntsville to work for her sister. Peggy did call Betty and said she was trying to help a handyman in town who needed work in order to keep his children fed and clothed. So Betty agreed to hire White, whom she'd never met, to do part of the work in her kitchen. But part of the deal, Betty said, was that he was going to get involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. Betty's instincts told her that it wasn't a good sign that he was not already in AA, but she decided that she would give this man a chance. But it was only going to be one chance.
So at some point in the negotiations over the work he would do in Huntsville, White was given a map to Betty's house. And from then on, he began making trips back and forth from Vincent to Huntsville in his pickup truck, driving 80 miles drunk and high. Now, he made these trips even though Betty had not actually agreed yet on a time for the work to begin, or even what the work was going to be, was it?
Yeah, he was going to help with the remodel, but specifically no.
Yeah, when he did set a time to come and do some work, he didn't show up, so...
Yeah, this guy was pretty much a mess. Betty's son Trey was living with Jack and Betty while he was going to college, and he had been at home on Thursday, May 21st, 1992. He'd been studying all morning. He had a short shift to work that afternoon in Jack's office, and then he had to go take a final exam. When Betty had first asked if her son could come and live with them and work for Jack while finishing college, Jack had been really happy. 2 of his own sons had failed to finish college, and that had been a major disappointment for him. So during Trey's time in the house, he and Jack had become really close. So that morning, Trey asked Betty if he and she could go to lunch together. They often ate with Jack either at home or at the hospital, but Jack had already called to say he wouldn't be eating lunch that day. Betty really didn't have time for lunch either, but she wanted to talk to Trey and let him know that he wasn't invited to go with her and Jack on their planned trip to Santa Fe the next day. She and Jack needed to be alone, and they agreed that they would go away from their obligations of their daily lives and spend time together. So Betty was trying to complete some last-minute errands, but if Trey was willing to follow her in his own car, she said they could eat together at the mall. But at the same time, James White was watching the Wilson house, and he was able to cut through the woods and into his pickup in time to follow them. Betty and Trey went into a music store in the mall where Trey bought some CDs. Betty stopped at a clothing store and bought a dress. Then the 2 of them crossed the parking lot and ate lunch together at the McDonald's. So White was really tired. He'd spent the previous night driving, drinking, smoking dope, and taking pills. He visited the Chick-fil-A restaurant in the mall. Then after eating, he needed to go somewhere to get some sleep. The nearest motel was an old Ramada Inn, and he chose this motel because it was the one nearest to him when he got tired of stalking Betty and her son at the mall that day. So he checked in at 12:47 p.m. and paid for the room in cash. After White got to his room, he dozed and drank some more. Then he made some phone calls, including a couple of calls to Betty Wilson's house. The machine there answered the phone, but White didn't leave a message. He didn't speak at all. There was a fundraiser for Tim Morgan, a candidate for district attorney, that was being held at a fellow doctor's house that night. So Betty and Jack knew people with money who had generally liberal Democratic leanings, and they would help to fund the Morgan campaign. Betty took Morgan by the arm and led him to the front of her friend's living room, where he made a brief, modest speech, and then the checks were piling up on a table near the door. After the party, the checks were counted and put into a blue bank bag, which Betty took home with her. It was her job to make the deposit in the Morgan campaign account at the bank the next day, and then take the receipt to campaign headquarters.
Then early the next morning, Trey went into Jack's room and told him he was not going to Santa Fe with them. He was joining some friends for a drive to the Florida beaches instead. So Jack and Betty ate breakfast together, and then Jack went to his office and Betty went to run errands. They met again for lunch at home, and Jack told Betty that he had to go back to the office and wrap up some work. So after 5 p.m. that day, Betty was out running errands when she remembered she hadn't made the bank deposit for the Tim Morgan campaign. It was a Friday, and the drive-through window at the bank would still be open. So she hurried back home to pick up the bank bag. And when she opened the front door, James White was upstairs in Jack's room. But as quickly as she was in, Betty was back out, and White moved to a front window and saw her carrying the blue bank bag to her car, then driving away. Neighbors saw Jack in front of the house a short time later, hammering a Tim Morgan campaign sign into the front lawn, using a baseball bat.
Yeah, so that night, May 22nd, 1992, at around 9:30 p.m., Betty called 911 from her neighbor's house. So Betty said that she thought her 55-year-old husband was attacked in their home. She had arrived home to find him lying in a pool of blood. So police found Dr. Jack Wilson dead on the landing at the top of the stairs. He was on his back with blood on the floor around him, and there was blood spatter on the walls. An aluminum baseball bat was found near his body with blood on it. In addition to being bludgeoned, he'd also been stabbed multiple times in his chest. So the initial police report was brief. Dead man upstairs, badly beaten, stabbed, obvious foul play, no forced entry. TV sets and videocassette players untouched, jewelry untouched, and no indication of a simple robbery. Phone line cut indicating attacker had been waiting. No one else in the house. Dead man is the owner. Call came from his wife. She came home, found the body, ran next door, called 911. Nothing obvious on the grounds. House and scene sealed. Detectives asked Betty to provide the names of housekeepers, workmen, and any other people who might be familiar with their house. She didn't mention James White at first, but then in a later conversation she did name him, along with a few others she'd forgotten to include in this first list. She explained that Mr. White was a carpenter who had been recommended to her by her sister, who lived in the Vincent area, about 80 miles south. So the next morning, detectives learned that a day before the murder, the Madison County Sheriff in Huntsville had passed on a tip that a rich person, possibly a doctor or a doctor's wife, was going to be killed. There was vague information in this tip about the victim or someone near the victim having a twin sister who was somehow involved. At that point, however, the tip was not the focus of the investigation. The murder looked more like a crime of passion than a burglary gone wrong. Investigators were devoting most of their energy to all family members and associates who might have had a reason or opportunity to kill Jack Wilson.
The week before the murder, James White had worked for a few days at a barbecue restaurant in a small town near Vincent. He had failed to show up again for work the week of the murder. But by Sunday morning, 48 hours after the killing, White had come down from his alcohol and drug binge, and he needed money. He called the restaurant and begged them to give him another chance. They agreed to give him one more chance. So he was at work at the restaurant on Sunday when Shelby County deputies came in and arrested him. In the initial interrogation, White was told that his drinking friend Janine Russell had ratted him out, that the police knew everything, and that they had proof that he had murdered Jack Wilson. Over the next 24 hours in custody, he denied that he had murdered Jack Wilson, but he did admit that he knew Peggy Lowe, who was Dr. Wilson's wife's twin sister. He may have admitted that he had been inside the Wilson house, but if he did, he quickly offered implausible reasons to explain why, and the more he talked, the more guilty he sounded. Now here's where I start having difficulty. To me, this is a tenuous connection for White and Wilson.
Yeah, I agree. But it's the only connection that they have.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the only way that he would have ever heard of Dr. Wilson would be through Peggy Lowe. So that part I can see.
Yes. How did they know to question White about the Wilson murder?
Because they got a tip from that drinking buddy of his, Janine Russell, that you were talking about, that he had been bragging about it, that he was going to kill a doctor for a twin. So when he was drunk, he would talk and he would tell stories. And most of the stories his friends would just laugh off because he would talk about how these women wanted him. And from all descriptions, he was pretty gross. He had rotten teeth and he was kind of hunched over and dirty and, just a mess. He had severe alcohol and drug problems.
Yeah.
But he had been talking about the twins, and he had started talking about how he was going to kill a doctor for money for a twin. So that's how the police got to him in the beginning.
Okay.
Betty was crying and was really difficult to talk to after Jack died. But then after a day or two, she was regaining her composure and becoming stronger. She was taking heavy doses of Valium, though, and hadn't been sleeping well since her husband's death. Questioning her about people who might have a motive to kill her husband, detectives asked her if she had ever had an affair or sex outside of her marriage. Well, she had, yes, and she calmly said that she had. When asked with whom, she said there had been several, and she was very willing to give them the names. In fact, Betty didn't even blush talking about this, and the detectives didn't like it. She told them she'd met most of the men that she slept with at AA meetings, and she explained to them why she did it was because her husband had been impotent and that he was aware of these activities. But I don't think the police ever really believed that. The idea that there was a personal reason for the murder grew stronger as more and more information came out. Jack had been bludgeoned, choked, and stabbed. That kind of murder doesn't always have a personal connection. It can happen that someone wanders in and then just goes over the top. But more often than not, it is personal. There seemed to be hatred in the way Jack Wilson was killed, and his wife seemed like a real hardened rich bitch to the detectives. She had looked 2 homicide cops in the eye and told them all about the men she'd had sex with. The physical facts of the case, no forced entry, no theft, and the savagery of the attack meant that it was smart for the Huntsville homicide cops to give the Betty Wilson connection a very thorough investigation.
By Tuesday, May 26th, James White said he was involved somehow with the twin sister. White was admitting that he had made trips to Betty Wilson's house in Huntsville, and he had talked on the phone many times to Peggy Lowe. Betty Wilson had told police that one of the people who might have had access to the house was a carpenter from Vincent. He had been in town the day before the murder, while she was not in town, and she said that she had fired him before he had ever come to the house.
Well, White was told that he was looking at the death penalty, and he began immediately testing the waters to get himself a deal. I might know some things, I might not, he said, but I got a family too, you know. I have kids I have to think about. I might be able to help with some things, but I have to be took care of, you know. I don't know if I should trust you or not. And he refused to have any of his interviews taped. According to a detective's notes, some of which he would later claim to have lost, White began by giving details of what he said was a murder-for-hire plot, in which the twins had contracted with him to kill Jack Wilson. Somewhere along the way, White had figured out that the police were very interested in Betty Wilson and her sister, Peggy Lowe. So if he was to implicate them, there were logical questions that would have to be answered to make his story work and make him believable. So his story in the first few days of interviews was this. He had been having an affair with Peggy Lowe, he said. He said they had never actually had sexual intercourse, but there had been moments, both at the school and at her home, when her husband was away, when she had not been able to resist a few stolen kisses with him. It seems impossible that anyone could have looked at White's rotting brown teeth and matted beard and not shudder at the thought of someone stealing one single kiss from him. But his story was in its early stages at this point. He still had plenty of time to iron out the details.
Yes, it's evolving.
It evolves a lot.
So White said he had been in Huntsville that Friday morning to do the job, but he said he had a crisis of conscience and began driving back to Vincent in the early morning. But then he started drinking and taking pills, and when he got high, his resolve returned, and he went back to Huntsville. Sometime between 2 and 3 p.m., he said he had met Betty Wilson at the Parkway City Mall for instructions. Then he went to the Wilson house. Now, at first, he said he did not remember killing Dr. Wilson, and thought that Dr. Wilson had still been alive when he left the house. He said he fled on foot through the woods and walked back to the mall where his truck was parked. He drove back to Vincent then, and then went out socializing with his brother and a friend.
Well, after the first interview in the Shelby County Jail was completed, the police were allowed to rearrest White under the jurisdiction of the Huntsville Police Department and remove him from the jail. Then they drove White from the jail to Vincent, where they visited his home on top of the hill above Peggy Lowe's church. They searched through White's clothing for the clothing he had worn during the murder, but they were unable to find any of the clothes he said he had worn that day, except for a pair of shoes. White led the police over to the broken porch and pried up a floorboard. Then a detective reached in and pulled out a handgun that was wrapped in a rag, and he said that the twins had given him that gun to kill Jack Wilson with. Detectives picked up Betty and Peggy separately on the day of Jack's memorial service. They confronted both of them with what James White had told them. Betty denied ever even meeting White, and Peggy vehemently denied having an affair with him or ever hiring him to kill anybody. So the police tried telling each twin that the other had turned on them, but they each refused to believe that. After that, they each hired attorneys. In order to afford it, Betty had to contact her accountant, who suggested that she sell Jack's medical practice. But there were some major credibility issues with James White's story. Even getting a judge to sign a warrant for the twins' arrest, let alone convincing the DA to prosecute them, was going to be impossible, unless White could explain things better. So according to the detective's rough notes, He was claiming that Betty Wilson had paid him a large amount of money to kill her husband, and he mentioned various amounts from $5,000 to $20,000. But if White had received that money shortly before the murder, he'd have to prove it. Under Alabama law, nothing he said could be used in court unless it could be independently corroborated.
And because he was going to admit that he was a co-conspirator, his word was worthless, according to the law, unless what he said was proven in some other way. When White paid his bills, he always paid at the last possible moment. But, as it happened, he had paid off about $2,500 in bills not too long before Jack Wilson was killed. No one may ever know where that money really came from, but White quickly offered up that it had come from the twins.
Yeah, the story really became this. James White had originally told the twins he could hire someone else to commit the murder for $20,000. But Betty Wilson, being cheap, had said that price was too high. And why would $20,000 be a lot of money for her? That doesn't make sense. So White had come in with a lower offer of $5,000, and the twins had agreed to that, but Betty said she would only pay half in advance, and then the other half on completion. So he said that shortly before the killing, she had paid him $2,500. So this really looked bad for Betty and Peggy. White was willing to say anything to get a plea deal, whether the twins were behind this murder or not. He claimed that he and Peggy had formed a friendship, and she had told him about her sister in Huntsville who wanted to get rid of her husband. And of course this sister was Betty Wilson. But in the course of asking White about the money, a detective asked him if he had ever received any money directly from Betty Wilson. Then White recalled that he had, and that the money, $200, had been passed to him in a library book at Guntersville State Lodge. Now, Betty would say she had given him that money so that he could get a hotel to stay at nearby and come to an AA meeting. This was before she had fired him. Police investigators were immediately sent to Vincent, where they searched White's pickup truck, and they found the library book that he had been talking about. It had been borrowed in the name of Betty Wilson. So this was an important breakthrough for them. Now they had a physical link between James White and Betty Wilson. But of course, according to Betty, she put the $200 in the library book because she expected him to come into the lodge, introduce himself, attend an AA meeting, and give her her book back. She didn't give him the gun either, she said. He had stolen it from the house. So it was difficult to understand why she would have given him a gun registered in her name and a library book she had checked out in her name. But early in the morning, Betty and Peggy were arrested, and they were led away from Peggy's house in handcuffs.
White suddenly remembered staying at the Ramada Inn the night before the murder. He remembered that Betty had met him at a fast food restaurant at the Parkway City Mall, a Chick-fil-A, and had passed him $100 in a used food bag to pay for a stay at the motel. He remembered wearing the ski mask the police had found in the Wilson home, and he suddenly remembered that while he was lying in the back seat of Betty Wilson's car, after committing the murder, with a pink clothing bag over him, he had noticed a light blue bank bag on the front seat. But there were still some things that needed to be remembered. It was a problem for investigators that there was no physical evidence to show that James White had ever been in Betty Wilson's car.
In his statements, he'd been willing to remember everything right up to the murder, sometimes in detail, as in the matter of Betty's flowered tennis shoes. He had been willing to remember everything right after the murder, such as the light blue bank bag on the front seat of Betty's car, too. But he continued to refuse to remember the murder itself, and he continued to insist that he wanted a written contract with the authorities guaranteeing him a light sentence in exchange for putting the twins in the electric chair. So some of the search for corroboration had very troubling results. A police dog handler had taken a scent-searching dog named Zeke to Betty's house at 2700 Boulder a short time after Jack's murder. The dog was given a piece of James White's clothing and searched the area. The dog picked up a scent near the back of the house and then made a straight path down through the woods where White had said in all of his early statements that he had escaped on foot after doing the killing. But the trouble was that White no longer remembered running away on foot. If Zeke the dog sniffed out a strong trail he had left through the woods, then the dog was actually confirming White's early version, which had not implicated Betty, and he was contradicting the suddenly remembered new version, which did implicate her. Also, no clothing was found where White had claimed to have buried his either. The behavior of the dog would have to be explained in court, and investigators would later say that the dog had an allergy during the search, which seems pretty ludicrous. So this missing clothing would become one of the biggest mysteries in the case.
Then, as he lay on his bunk in the jail early one morning, White said, a vision came into him. A vision of Mrs. Betty Wilson, bending down beside her BMW on the parking lot at Parkway City Mall, taking off her shoes and slipping her feet into a brand new pair of tennis shoes, flowered tennis shoes. So from here on out, everything Betty had told the police in her first statements would become corroborating evidence, helping White's accusations against her.
So on February 23, 1993, when the trial of Betty Wilson finally began, pretty much all of the North Alabama and Birmingham media were represented. The Betty Wilson trial had become an obsession. By the time the deputies managed to shut the door to the courtroom against the gang of angry people who were left in the corridor, there were 120 or more people jammed into a set of pews that was intended to hold 96 people. A deputy led the jurors in from a door at the back of the courtroom. 12 regular jurors and 2 alternates, 12 men and 2 women. Of the 12 regular jurors, 3 were black, a young man, an older man, and a late middle-aged woman. The overwhelming majority of the jury then was made up of white men, most of whom were middle-aged to elderly, and most of whom were working class. That's with the exception of a professor, a retired doctor, and a businessman. So with her back to the public and her profile to the jury, Betty wore a well-tailored gray houndstooth suit. Her hair had been cut short and colored black, streaked white on the sides. The suit, the hair, and an expert application of makeup was all intended to make her look like a respectable woman. But it didn't work. Betty had spent the better part of a year locked in a jail cell by the time her trial began. Her only contact with the outside world had been through her attorney. And over the months, James White had had dental work and a makeover. Betty Wilson was the white woman who had slept with African-American men in her sick husband's house, and she was very hated. Betty's will to survive had kept her going, but just barely. By the time she got to trial, her ordeal was really showing on her face. Betty looked hardened. She was pale and she was terrified. The first day of her trial was not good either. The prosecutor was friendly and won over the jurors with his good old boy persona. He told them about Dr. Jack Wilson, the Huntsville ophthalmologist whose patients had all adored him. He led the jurors to the moment of the murder, and he told them about James White, the man who had killed Dr. Wilson. He moved in close to the railing, separating him from the jurors, and he put his hands on the rail and faced them silently for a moment. Then he told them, when the police found Jack Wilson, his forearms had been beaten and broken. His skull had been beaten and crushed. He'd been stabbed in the abdomen. He died on the second story of his own house, just outside of his wife's bedroom, in a pool of his own blood. Then he went on to describe Betty as a vain and selfish woman. She was obsessed with her own image and appearance, and with having things, and with a big house, and the 2 expensive cars. Everything all of us would think of as the good life, but she wanted more. He said that Betty was cruel to Jack and she cheated on him. Then he described a triangle. On one side is Betty Wilson, on the other side her twin sister Peggy Lowe, and on the third side is James White. Then in the center is Jack Wilson, the victim. He said like wet hay in the barn, all the elements were together for spontaneous combustion. So he had a flair for the dramatic.
Yes, I think so. So the jury was told that Jack Wilson had left behind a $6 million estate, which would all go to his wife Betty. James White, under indictment for his part in the murder and obligated to take the stand as part of his plea deal, testified that he was hired by Betty and her sister Peggy to kill Dr. Wilson. He said that one of the reasons he had committed the murder was to win Peggy's affection. White said that after he was paid, he paid some past due utility bills, deposited $500 in his bank account, which was $400 overdrawn, and spent the rest on his kids. White said that Peggy started pressuring him to kill Jack Wilson after he had intercourse with her on May 15, 1992. He said that his money was all gone, so Peggy had told him to go and see Betty at Lake Guntersville State Park and get some money from Betty, who was at an AA meeting. Peggy described Betty's car, a black BMW, and told him to get the library book, which would have cash in it.
Yeah, White testified that 2 days before May 16th, he received a phone call from Betty asking him what was going on and why Dr. Wilson had not been killed yet. She wanted Jack dead before May 24th so she wouldn't have to go on vacation to Santa Fe with him on their planned trip. He went on to say that he was given the gun by Betty. Then he took it home, wrapped it in a towel, and hid it under some boards. He said he needed more money on May 21st, and Betty met him at the Chick-fil-A at the mall around noon and gave him a bag with $100 in it. He testified that around 3 p.m. on Friday, May 22nd, as he got out of her car, he'd noticed Betty's flowered tennis shoes. He got down on the floor and she drove him to her house. When they arrived, she pulled into the garage and handed him $40 and told him where her husband's bedroom was located. Dr. Wilson was not home at that time. White testified that he decided not to use the gun and instead took some rope along with him. He said he waited in the house for several hours for Dr. Wilson to arrive. Then, as he was walking on the landing of the stairs, he came face to face with Jack Wilson. After this, he said they wrestled, and he hit Dr. Wilson with an object that he couldn't identify. Then he blanked out and found himself behind the house in the woods. Then he went back to the house, where Betty picked him up and drove him to the mall, where he had left his truck parked. His remaining $2,500 was supposed to be left in Peggy Lowe's garage on the Sunday after the murder, he said, but there was no money there. There was no physical evidence. There were no witnesses. There was only James White's accusation. If he wasn't seen as credible, then the whole story would fall apart.
It sure would. So witnesses who corroborated James White's story said that he had a great deal of money immediately after Jack Wilson's murder. The head teller at his bank said that he had made no deposits to his account from January to April 1992. At the time of his $500 deposit, April 27th, his account was overdrawn by $400. The owner of a local grocery store testified that White came in on May 22nd and paid her for 2 checks which had been returned for insufficient funds. White was questioned about money he received through lawsuits, approximately $34,000, and White explained the money was used for his children's expenses from ex-wives, especially for Christmas. So with his job as a cook and drug dealer and the money from the lawsuit and working odd jobs, he was making nearly $100,000 a year. Far from a poor man, he was more than likely someone who could not finance his income properly. He owned property, a vehicle, and was able to support his drug use and alcohol habit.
The state presented evidence that Betty Wilson was unhappy in her marriage, and this was easy to do because Betty had been very outspoken, she'd had multiple lovers, and she and Jack slept in separate bedrooms. An employee from Dr. Wilson's office testified that Betty was unkind to him, and she once told her that she would rather be a well-respected widow than a divorcee. Shirley Green, the Wilsons' housekeeper, testified that the Wilsons slept in separate bedrooms, and that Betty had made derogatory remarks about her husband, including that she called his colostomy bag a shit bag. She also confirmed that Betty had brought several other men to the house when Jack was out. There was also testimony about what had gone on at Lake Guntersville State Park. Keith Tucker, a security guard, testified that White had come to the park on May 16th and wanted to get a book from Betty Wilson's car. Another security guard testified that he had accompanied Betty to her black BMW to get the book. Telephone records confirmed that there was a 10-minute phone call made to Peggy Lowe's house from a payphone at the store about 3 miles from the park's entrance. The manager of the Ramada Inn testified that James White stayed there on the evening of May 21st, that he paid cash for the room, and that he made several phone calls from that room, and records would confirm that he had called Peggy Lowe. Witnesses testified about Betty's behavior on the day of the murder as well. The manager of a department store had sold Betty a pair of flowered tennis shoes. A neighbor of Betty's identified White as a man she had seen limping in the direction of the Wilson house at around 5 p.m., and then she had seen Betty driving toward her house at 5:15. Witnesses testified that Betty didn't arrive at her 5:25 p.m. AA meeting until 6 p.m., and that she was dressed casually with flowered tennis shoes. Betty's defense was that she was trying to help James White get into AA. Peggy Lowe testified that the occurrences at the state park were just an effort by Betty to try and give White money so that he could come to the AA meeting and then spend the weekend nearby.
Late on the afternoon of the first day of the trial, when all the jurors were beginning to tire, the prosecutor brought Dr. Joseph Embry, who was the chief pathologist for the Alabama Department of Forensic Science. He was called to the stand. Dr. Embry spoke in a soft voice as he handled and commented on the photos of the body and murder scene. There are 9 tears in the head, including 2 on the forehead, and these pictures were 8 by 10-inch glossy police photos. So as Embry finished describing each picture, the prosecutor took them over to the jury box to be passed from juror to juror. So the most severe tear was at the front of the head, which caused a skull fracture right in the midline of his forehead. The prosecutor handed the jurors portrait, taken straight on from a few inches away, of Jack Wilson's face on the floor. The front of his skull was caved in and crimson with blood, and his eyes were bulging out from their sockets. Jack's dead face with the eyes knocked out of his skull, and his bloody skull with his scalp peeled back, were shocking pictures to look at. Betty was afraid that any emotion she showed might be interpreted by the jury as fake, but at the same time she was afraid that failing to show emotion would be interpreted as callousness. Many of Betty's friends and acquaintances had thrown her under the bus, and they all believed her to be guilty.
Yeah, the prosecutor led Embry through a detailed description of Jack Wilson's 2 stab wounds. The one just above the navel is U-shaped, Embry said, and goes through the abdomen wall, through the stomach and pancreas, severing the inferior mesenteric vein and the left renal vein, stopping just in front of the aorta and 2.5 inches deep into the body. Embry concluded that both the knife wounds and the baseball bat injuries would have been fatal, each without the other. So this was an overkill.
So a little overkill.
Yeah. There were 2 days of deliberations by the jury. There was one holdout who didn't believe that Betty was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but she was eventually convinced to vote for a unanimous verdict of guilty. Both the prosecutor and the defense had agreed that it would be very difficult to win a death sentence because Betty was not a physical participant in the murder and because of the relatively light sentence that White had received by getting Betty convicted. He received a life sentence, but he was eligible for parole in just 7 years. Both sides agreed to petition the judge jointly, and they asked him to waive the penalty trial and go ahead and give her a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. So the judge agreed to that. And they never really figured out exactly how Jack was bludgeoned. There were experts that thought the bat couldn't be the weapon. They thought it was something narrower, like rebar or like a fireplace poker. So they really never figured this out completely. I don't think we're ever really going to know what happened. I do believe that White did it, but I don't know if he remembers doing it. He was in such a drug, alcohol state.
Yeah, I think you could convince me that White did the actual crime.
Yes.
But I'm still not sure.
Well, I can believe that he did it, but I really don't know why he did it. I can see him stalking Betty and just being in the house when Jack comes home and just going crazy. That happens. In the weeks after the verdict, Peggy and Wayne Lowe had to deal with their feelings of sorrow for Betty, as well as their fear of what may lay ahead for Peggy.
Yeah, she hasn't gone to trial yet.
No. And it's not looking good for her if her sister's convicted.
It sure isn't.
Betty had been defended by the best lawyers that money could buy, too, because she had a lot more money than Peggy. Even though Betty couldn't pay them unless she won an acquittal and inherited Jack's estate, her legal team had been willing to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of their own time in Betty's case, betting that they would win and then they'd be paid. But we know they'd lost and they would never be paid. Peggy and Wayne had a combined family income of about $50,000 a year, and they had no savings. Every dollar they'd earned had gone into their home, their modest expenses, and their children. Remember, they also gave a lot to charity, including James White.
Right.
Now, the only thing they could offer lawyers was the national attention that the case might bring them. But the jury had believed James White, and of course he would testify in Peggy's trial as well. If her sister had been found guilty based on a story that included Peggy as a co-conspirator, Peggy felt that her chances of an acquittal were not good at all. When it came time for Peggy's trial, the state would put on the same evidence that it had presented in Betty's trial. There really was no other evidence. It was virtually the same case, only with a different twin sitting at the defense table. So if Betty had lost, there was every reason to believe that Peggy would as well.
Sure.
So in the 6 months between Betty's conviction and the beginning of Peggy's trial, the people of Peggy's church and the town continued to support her. Once they came running out of storefronts and physically chased off a group of reporters who'd come to town to cover the story. They didn't believe that Peggy could be guilty, and they would never weaken in this conviction.
Whenever she thought that the fear was going to crush her, it was her community and her church that saved her. But Peggy felt that it was her who had failed her twin. After all, she was the one who had sent James White to Betty in the first place. Now Betty had gone to prison, and Peggy, the family hero, was not too far behind. Peggy couldn't afford a high-profile lawyer. She hired David Cromwell Johnson, a middle-aged criminal defense attorney in Birmingham with a good reputation. And Johnson was able to bring in Herman Watson of Huntsville. Watson had represented members of the Dixie Mafia in the old days in Alabama and had taken part in major political trials more recently. So this was a major win, having him added to the team.
But 18 months of investigating had failed to turn up a single shred of evidence that Peggy had ever done anything bad in her whole life. It was going to be difficult, if not impossible, to get any jury to believe that a woman who had led a completely upright and virtuous life had fallen into a murder plot after suddenly falling in love with the drunken lowlife like James White. Given more time and an entire trial record to go by, the second twins' defense team might be able to do what Betty's team had failed to do. They might be able to show the jury how the police had filtered information to White and poisoned his testimony. So in spite of what had happened to Betty, Peggy did have a chance. But every time Peggy allowed herself to be hopeful, she remembered that Betty's lawyers had insisted that they would win Betty's case right up until when the verdict was read. So Peggy's trial was moved to Montgomery and set for September 13, 1993. In the months leading up to the trial, Madison County District Judge William Page, who was presiding over the case, had made it known in several hearings that he thought White's testimony was very suspect, that the signed contract Mo Brooks had given White was crazy. Mo Brooks was the current DA, very conservative, and that the state needed to come up with more corroboration than it had in Betty Wilson's trial. No law enforcement investigator in Alabama had ever been able to find a single witness, piece of paper, electronic record, or other evidence that would support the allegation that Betty Wilson had gathered the $2,500 in $20 bills to pay James White to kill her husband. Because in reality, it's not easy for the average person in the modern world to put together that much cash without leaving some kind of a financial footprint. If the cash had come from her own bank, there would be a computer record. If she wrote a check somewhere else, there would be a record of the check. Even if she had taken other bills and converted them to 20s, there would be a record. If she had always kept a stash of several $1,000s in $20 bills in her home, someone would have known about it. She did have a housekeeper. Also, after months of searching, investigators had failed to turn up any physical evidence to back up White's story of those car rides to and from the murder scene. And no one ever had any indication that Peggy could have been romantically involved with James White. So the state's plan was basically to put Betty on trial again. It was all going to come down to Betty being found guilty already. Getting a second jury to believe she was still guilty wouldn't be too difficult. It wasn't possible to inform the jury of the first jury's verdict, but by reading testimony from the first trial record at this trial, and by going over the details of the alleged plot, the prosecution would be able to make this point. So no matter what the judge told these jurors, the knowledge of Betty's conviction would certainly get around. They were twins. Twins have secrets. Twins are unlike other human beings. Neither owns a whole conscience of their own. But in the process of discovery, the state had turned over absolutely nothing. They had found nothing new for this case. So they'd have to go with what they already had, and that was basically Betty's conviction. So the defense was able during cross-examination of James White to go through his own personal criminal history before he had met Peggy Lowe. The events that Betty's prosecutor had successfully presented to the first jury as just youthful indiscretions now came across in much more lurid detail. So one example was a run-in with the law, which White had explained away in the first trial as some bad luck he had suffered while hitchhiking in Arkansas. But in fact, he and another man were picked up by a married couple who were traveling with a U-Haul trailer behind their car. White and his buddy had locked the husband in the trailer and were headed off to do God knows what with the wife when a group of state troopers surrounded the car with shotguns and forced them out. So White had served 5 years, and he had escaped and was captured and convicted of selling drugs. Then he was returned to prison where he was charged with sodomy. So he interrupted the defense attorney self-righteously while being questioned about this, to tell him that the sodomy had not occurred while he was in prison, but actually while he was in the Talladega County Jail, awaiting trial on car theft charges.
What a genius.
So that should make all the difference, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't prison sodomy, it was jail sodomy. So they're actually able to show him in a much less positive light in this trial. In Peggy's trial, by going over it in detail, her defense attorney was able to get the jury to understand how White had changed his story in order to get his plea deal. He was able to use the state's witnesses and the state's evidence to show that the state's version of what had happened was actually impossible. Betty's time was accounted for almost minute by minute by their corroborative evidence. Except for the few minutes when she returned to the house at 5 p.m. for the bank bag, there were no gaps when she could have driven White to the house and then returned to give him a ride back to his truck. Also, Dr. Wilson was on the phone chatting with people after the time he would have had to die in order for Betty to have been in on it. And then for every witness the prosecution had presented to call Betty Wilson a slut, the defense team presented at least 2 to testify to Peggy Lowe's kindness, honesty, and virtue. Some of the stories of Peggy and Wayne's generosity were so moving that the jurors got teary-eyed as the witnesses spoke. One after another, people took the stand to tell how the Lowes, who were people of very modest means, had reached out to give support to people in need. There were unwed mothers who took the stand to tell how the Lowes had opened their home to them. Women who had known Peggy for years came to the stand to talk about her tolerance and her generosity. Wayne and Peggy's children came to the stand, and they spoke movingly of their happy childhoods and the happiness of their home life. Wayne testified, and he came across as a strong, responsible, and honest man.
Peggy took the stand in her own defense. The jurors were ready to believe Betty had been falsely convicted. They were ready to believe James White was a liar. They were even willing to accept that the police had gotten themselves wrapped up in White's lies. But it all depended on what the jury thought of Peggy. So on the stand, Peggy talked about her remarriage, going to college, and becoming a teacher. She said that Jack Wilson was one of the most caring, sympathetic, kind-hearted men she has ever met. Then she talked about meeting James White. She told how she and Stephanie and Wayne were eating lunch together in her classroom when White came in and asked for more work. When asked, "Did you have sexual intercourse with James White?" she said no, in an angry, bitter voice. The first time I ever heard of the accusation of sex was at Betty's trial.
Her attorney asked her why she had referred James White to her sister, and she explained that Mr. White had called her and said he was suicidal. He said he had tried to kill himself. She explained all of the calls back and forth, White's trip to Guntersville, and each and every detail of the state's story. And the longer she talked, the more accepting the jury became. She came across as a middle-class person from humble beginnings who had led a good life. So the jury deliberated for just 2 hours, long enough to elect a foreman, reread the judge's instructions, talk for a while, and take a vote. Peggy was acquitted on all counts. But after Peggy's acquittal, the media would continue to report as if both of the twins had been found guilty. So Betty can't get out of prison because her sister was found not guilty when tried on the same facts as her case. Her lawyers have to find new information or errors in her trial in order to free her. But the information that should free her is the same evidence that was presented in her trial. There's no new information. If the only mistake was the jury's mistake in the verdict, that they looked at all the evidence and came to the wrong conclusion, that won't help her. That can't be used on appeal.
And shockingly, the lies which earned James White his light sentence have been recanted. In a sworn affidavit signed in prison on June 1st, 1994, James White confessed that the whole story he told in court to help get the twins convicted was a lie. He said that his resentment toward Peggy's rejecting him romantically influenced him to make false accusations against her and her sister. He also admitted to never meeting Betty Wilson in person. He said that Peggy Lowe helped him find work in 1991. He said he began to think of her in romantic terms. He remembered sharing these feelings with her, and then she laughed at him. At the same time, he said that his memory of this entire period of his life is clouded by alcohol and drug use. So he might not even know himself what's true and what's not.
I don't think he does. I really don't think he does. Unfortunately, White also tried to say in that same document, though, that he really had nothing to do with Jack Wilson's death. So when reporters asked him about White's recantation, Betty's former prosecutor responded that the statement was worthless because it was impossible to believe anything James White said. The irony. That's irony, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But White's word was the core of the state's case against both twins. There was no physical evidence. There were no eyewitnesses. Nothing except James White's story. And of course, he's an admitted lifelong chronic liar. Like everything else James White has ever said in his life, the statement offered a little bit of truth wrapped up in lies. So it really didn't help anyone. Betty Wilson remarried in prison. Back in 2002, an Army contractor named Bill Campbell saw Betty on 48 Hours, and he was shocked by Betty's conviction and began writing to her. So they were married 4 years later. They had cake and they drank Mountain Dew and Dr. Pepper. James White was up for parole after just 7 years in prison, but he has been repeatedly denied. His last effort was in 2021. Betty's appeals have been denied despite growing support for her claims of innocence. There's a Facebook page, Justice for Betty Wilson, and a documentary on the case titled Finding Betty that was released in 2022.
What about Peggy?
Well, Peggy didn't get convicted. Peggy's fine, but she still supports Betty and wants to help get her out of prison. I think actually Peggy did end up remarrying, so her and Wayne did break up. There's a lot of stress they were under.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it seems like Betty's innocent. I can't 100% say that, but certainly seems like it was an unjust conviction to me.
It does.
Yeah. If you're basing the whole case on someone who's a liar, that's really not cool. It has worked beautifully for them.
Yep, so far.
It's time for listener feedback.
Okay, Dickie, how about some feedback?
Yeah, I got a fair amount of feedback for you this time.
Yay.
So we have 3 voicemails.
Beautiful.
And an email. And there's still some voicemails put up here. I'm just going to dole them out from time to time.
Thanks, guys. Keep them coming. So let's start with a voicemail from Nate. We've had several from Nate lately, and they've been very good.
Hi, Joe and Dick. It's Nate again. I have one more case to suggest. This one, I think I sent you a book on. It's the death of Justin Cosby at Harvard University. He was a student there, and he was murdered in a conspiracy. 2 other female students who were involved in his murder were expelled from Harvard. One of them ended up going to prison under a plea deal, and then the shooter and the other people involved got life or close to life sentences. I just think it's interesting because it happened right here in Boston, and it's Harvard University, and there are not that many murders associated with Harvard. So I don't know if you guys are interested in covering that or not. But anyway, both of you, obviously, cheers. I don't have a beer suggestion for it, but I'm sure you could find a mass beer. Maybe Sam Adams. That's kind of a cop-out. But anyway, cheers.
Well, Sam Adams isn't bad, is it?
No, and it does represent Boston quite well.
Absolutely. Yes, it does.
But like Nate said, there's plenty of beers that I could choose from. So
yes, in Massachusetts, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, what was that one we really liked in the small town? Was it Night Owl? Remember what I'm talking about?
Night Shift.
Night Shift, yes. That's a great brewery.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have we done any of those on a show?
I don't think so.
Oh, well, that would be a great one to do because they have lovely beers. I miss that place. But back to true crime. I remember this case very well. Harvard student Brittany Smith helped her boyfriend and 2 other men kill Justin Cosby. She gave her student ID to the boyfriend so he could gain access to a dormitory, and she also hid the gun that was used in the killing. She ended up pleading guilty to accessory after the fact, and she lied about her involvement, and she only got 3 years in prison. So in a memoir, Murder at Harvard Kirkland House, A Mother's Worst Nightmare, Justin Cosby's mother Denise tells the story of her son's life, death, and legacy. And Nate sent this to us probably 2-3 years ago because I remember reading it on vacation.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, so we are familiar with it, and it's certainly something that could be in an upcoming episode.
With a Boston beer.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nate. So next we have a voicemail from...
We have a voicemail from Bex.
From Bex. So
who's a fairly frequent flyer with us also.
Yeah, we've got all our regulars today. Okay, let's see what Bex has to say.
Hey, this is Bex, and I have another case suggestion. I just came across this case very recently. I had never heard of it, even though it was a 1976 case. So it is this case of Cullen Davis and the murders of Andrea Wilborn and Stan Farr and the shooting of Priscilla Davis. So Cullen was an extremely wealthy heir to a Texas oil fortune. He was married to Priscilla, and they were in the middle of a very, very contentious divorce. He was forced to move out of his dream home, which was a mansion he had built, and his soon-to-be ex-wife was living there. He was also paying for Priscilla's expenses and paying support above and beyond that. And as we see in cases like this, money and greed can lead people to murder. So that night, Cullen's stepdaughter, 12-year-old Andrea, was staying overnight at the mansion. Priscilla came home late that night with a man named Stan Farr. Priscilla noticed some blood and then froze in the kitchen while Cullen, dressed in disguise, stepped out of the shadows and shot her. She yelled, "It's Cullen, run, Stan." So Stan shut the door between him and the shooter, allegedly, Cullen, right? But he was shot and killed anyway. Priscilla was not dead, and she managed to escape while 2 other people simultaneously arrived at the house. This couple also ran into the shooter, and the woman identified him as Cullen. The man was shot dead, and this young woman ran. She was a runner. She ran as fast as she could, jumped over a wall, and ended up escaping and went for help. Police later found Priscilla's daughter, Andrea, dead in the basement. They think Priscilla let her they think Andrea, the stepdaughter, let Cullen into the house that night before the other adults came home. And Cullen was able to use his family money to pay for the best defense he could get. And I'll leave it there without telling how it all turned out. I don't know if you have heard of this story, Dick and Jill. I checked. I don't think you've done this story on your podcast. I think it'd be super interesting. And I just Google it, and there's tons of articles, details, etc. on the web. And Texas, not familiar that much with Texas beer, Dick, but I'm sure you could find a good one.
Thank you, Bex.
Thanks, Bex.
Good case.
At this point, we could really be hiring on Bex and Nate as our research and show producers.
There we go.
Because they're bringing in all the ideas. I had not really heard of this case. I did look into it. There's a book from 1979 titled Blood Will Tell, which was a little confusing because we did another case that had a book by the same name, right? But that really sounds like a very interesting case, Bex. I'm definitely on this one. Okay, next we have a voicemail from Erin. And it looks like Erin is right to the point. It's a 30-second voicemail.
Hi, Jill and Dick. Love your podcast so very much. One of my top favorites. Case suggestion. The case of Trey Zwicker, his stepbrother, Josh Young, was acquitted of his murder. Fascinating case, and I really don't hear many podcasts that cover it. I think I may have heard one. And it just fascinated me, the entire case. So it would be awesome if you guys would cover that. Love y'all.
Great. Thanks, Erin. So this is quite the case as well. It was May 11th, 2011, when Terrence Trey Zwicker was found beaten to death in a creek bed behind Liberty High School on East Indian Trail in Louisville. So Trey was a freshman honor roll student at Seneca High School at the time of his death, and his stepbrother was arrested for the murder, but his father testified during his trial that he was the one who beat the stepson to death with a pipe and that it just felt right. So the stepfather said he took Trey behind Liberty High School to confront him about stealing a lighter and a plate of food, and then killed him with the pipe, which he rinsed off in the creek. so no murder weapon was ever found. So it's still kind of a mystery, but it seems like the home life was very iffy at best.
Yeah, he didn't have a nurturing home life.
No, it sounds terrible, and I'd like to find out more about the mother.
Yeah.
And what she had thought of all this, so that's another one I'd really like to look into. So thank you very much, Aaron. All right, so that's 3 voicemails. Let's do the one email that you have here.
Yeah, okay. This is Vanessa. She says, "Hi, Jill and Dick. I love your show and have listened to every episode. I have a book and case suggestion. After listening to the Karla Homolka episode, I was reminded of a book I read during my days as a forensic psychologist.
Wow.
I think you would really find interesting. The title of the book is Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us."
Yes, so thanks, Vanessa. I did look up this book on Amazon and ended up ordering it for my Kindle. The description says that people are fascinated with serial killers like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, and they are good examples of a psychopath. People with psychopathy are aware of the consequences of their actions and do know the difference between right and wrong, but they're self-centered, remorseless, and really unable to care about the feelings of others. They often seem completely normal, and of course, most of them aren't killers. This book describes a world of con artists, hustlers, rapists, and other predators. And it really explains how to recognize these people and even how to protect ourselves. So this is really some valuable information. I think I'd like to read it and probably could apply it to future episodes.
Yeah, well, I think the book sounds fascinating.
It does, yeah. I've read a couple of books on psychopathy, and it is really fascinating because it seems like they're born that way. It doesn't seem like they really have control over themselves for the most part.
Yeah.
Which is hard for us to accept because they do such heinous things.
Well, and you said also that the vast majority of psychopaths are not murderers.
Exactly, right.
So maybe a little psychopathy can help you.
Help you? Really?
In terms of work.
Okay.
Schooling, maybe.
All right. In terms of being motivated and not letting other people's thoughts or feelings affect you in any way, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
You can kind of just push forward and say, fuck it. Yeah.
I'm going to go and do this.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, I see your point. So Vanessa is a forensic psychologist. I'm impressed. I'm impressed that someone with that background would bother listening to us about crimes.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Okay, well, we're going to leave for today. Just a quick reminder that we do have a premium option of TCB, and you can get early, ad-free, and bonus shows. We do a bonus case or 2 every month. Our most recent one was a case about a 2-year-old. And I know some people really can't stand to listen to cases about children, but I found this one fascinating. And since we have a pediatrician on staff here, I think we got some really great insight into that case. We also send our new subscribers a gift with a personalized thank you note. And it's easy to subscribe. You can do it while listening right now. Just go to tygrabber.com/subscribe and you'll get all of them going back years with no ads. Because you also get every episode without ads, the regular episodes.
That's right.
Which is nice because I hate ads. Other ways that you can really help the show are to give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And of course, we love to get emails and voicemails with your feedback and case suggestions. And if you do enjoy the show, maybe tell a friend or two who you think might be interested. If you do have feedback or case suggestions to share, you can send an email to truecrimebrewery@tygrabber.com. And voicemails are super easy. You can just go to our website on any device, your computer, your iPad, your phone, and right there you just click record a voicemail. And as long as you have a microphone on that device, you're all set. And we do love to get them, as I'm sure you know by now if you've been listening. So thanks everyone, and we will be back soon with another episode of True Crime Brewery. So we'll see you at the quiet end.
That's right. Plenty of room. Come on down.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.